it was always, looking forward to the 21st century, and a lot of conversation in different places about, when Orwell wrote, he was looking way into the future, but that was like what, wasn't it 1984? And yet the century I grew up in, top. Now, who did not, who here did not grow up in the 20th century? So we have 21st centurions, right? So just understand something before you make too much fun of the baby boomers, the generation before me, and those that follow. Top 25 inventions, if you just simple Google search, and I know there's a lot of misinformation out there, but when I just do a simple Google search, you know what the top 25 inventions are? Inventions of the 20th century, where I was born: airplanes, automobiles, radio, TV, computer, internet, the World Wide Web, penicillin, semiconductors / transistors, nuclear fission power, vaccines, laser, jet engine, plastic, microprocessor, microwave, artificial satellites, like Sputnik, GPS. Where would you guys be in the 21st century without GPS, right? My first trip to Germany, they had just come out with the maps you could put on the phone. Well, those things were so primitive, but they did work. Got me around Germany. So glad for the silence feature, though, because I got kind of tired of the voice. GPS, antibiotics, fiber optics, the compact disc and digital storage, video games and consoles, reusable spacecraft. 20th century. We might be doing a lot to perfect those. 20th century, a lot happened. So when you go back to Jesus' day, none of this stuff, just understand something, none of this stuff was a surprise to Jesus. He was there when the world began. He created it. John chapter 1 tells us that. Those of us who believe, it's what we believe. So why would he say the kingdom of the heavens is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field? It's the smallest of seeds, but when it is grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Told him another parable. Kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leaven. Why would Jesus? I have so many questions about this passage. Like, why would Jesus call it a tree when it really isn't? And why would he speak of leaven when it was in people's minds then? And it's in the New Testament. You guys have seen teachings on it, when it's often used to illustrate how sin, corruption, and evil work. Why would Jesus teach this? Just to confuse, or, for those of us now that are in the information age, be able to drill down and say, well, Jesus was an idiot. It wasn't a tree. Parables were meant to open eyes and ears for those without understanding. Particularly now in today's world. I believe, as I've studied this deeper, that Jesus did it incredibly intentionally. And it was a profound moment when Jesus was communicating what few actually caught and probably still aren't catching today. First thing I want to talk about What grows from the mustard seed is a tree, but not really. And why would I say that? And I should say something else, just like I looked up on Google. There's a lot that I'm going to talk about here that, there's a benefit of the information age. I did some kind of deep diving in with AI, not just, and so I believe what I'm going to tell you is accurate, but hey, look at it. And when I did, what I found was it really isn't a tree. But just like it's not really a tree, his kingdom of heaven isn't really like the kingdoms we know. The kingdoms we see in this world, and then you look at the kingdom of heaven, that's one of the reasons people miss the kingdom of heaven. Because it's a kingdom, but not like our kingdoms. Not really. And that's one of the points I think Jesus is making. So why am I saying this? Well, we've already read verses 32 and 33. Jesus calls it a tree. And so we defend it because Jesus said that, and I believe in Jesus. And yet, if we don't step back and ask these questions, we really miss one of Jesus' biggest points. And I think people have been missing it for generations. It's not our job to defend. It's our job, please catch this. It's our job to understand. Jesus doesn't need us to defend him. He needs us to listen and hear and understand him. And that's what he's saying by the point of all these parables. Now, what the passage does say is that this mustard seed that's planted grows into the largest of all the garden plants. The birds of the air come and nest in its branches because from a distance, these look like branches. In fact, it's not uncommon at all that this plant that grows, it sometimes will grow 15 feet tall. 10 to 15 feet is not uncommon for that plant. And the plant that he's likely referring to, we would call, I believe it's the Brassica nigra species. And it would flourish such that birds would come and rest on its branches. Jesus says that. So remember, Jesus is speaking to an agrarian people, agricultural world. Everybody had a garden. I'm not saying by that there were dumb farmers. Please get that. In today's world, because we think we know so much, we sometimes look at this and make those conclusions. I'm not suggesting at all they were dumb farmers, and so Jesus had to dumb it down to what they could understand. But don't think either that they actually thought this was a tree. They grew gardens, and they knew the difference. And I'm not saying Jesus was being disingenuous. Jesus is speaking to people who knew all about the mustard seed plant. They knew that it was a tree, and yet not really. It wasn't like an apple tree, an oak tree, or a sequoia tree. And before we actually talk a little bit about the plant, I just want to ask you a question. What do you think? What imagery would you use to describe some impressive work of the kingdom of God? We're going to look at it in a little bit, but in the Old Testament, it talks about cedar trees. In America, we would probably talk because what we think of that is 1,000 years old or more, it's amazing, or the sequoias. I remember as a little kid going out west, how amazing it was, the sequoia tree. I went out there when you could see where they had that one carved out where the car drove under it. Now, I think I should have checked by now. I shouldn't say what I'm not sure of, but is that still standing? I'm not sure that it is. The point is, we think of these sequoia trees, massive, stately. Jesus didn't talk about the sequoia tree. He's talking about this plant, greatest in the garden, big in the garden. But it's not a sequoia tree, not an oak tree. The germination of this garden plant is 7 to 10 days, this little tiny black seed. The sequoia and oak trees, 30 to 60 days to germinate. The leaves for a sequoia tree, it's 4 to 10 days after sprouting. For the mustard plant, it's 2 to 3 weeks. For blossoms, it's 5 to 7 weeks for the mustard plant. For the sequoia, get this now. This is actually important for what I'm going to say later. How long do you think it's before a sequoia tree blossoms? It's 10 or 20 years. And for the oak tree, it's 20 or 50 years to 50 years. That is according to the AI I looked up. The seed pods, the fruit, I also had information here about apple trees, but I didn't get into all that. But the sequoia, for it to bear fruit, seed pods, acorns, oak, 10 to 20 years. You know, they come from the blossom. 20 to 50 for the oak. These tiny little seeds of the Brassica nigra or the mustard plant, this is the fruit. And these seeds are used for spices, and they were valued for spices. Our mustard is actually, well, unless it's made, some of what we might be made chemicals, but true mustard today that we use for condiment actually comes from these seeds. They grind it. And they used to create a paste for their spices, or they would create a powder for this mustard spice. It was also used for medicinal purposes. Interesting thing though, and I hope I come back to this in just a minute. I thought it was interesting because when I looked up, well, what kind of plant is this? What I discovered was it's considered an invasive species in places like California, places in the United States. But in Palestine, it's not considered invasive. The seeds are everywhere. It grows everywhere, but it's not considered invasive because it's a native species. But it's gone all over the place. Biggest difference. This is so important. This is the whole deal here. The biggest difference, life cycle. Mustard tree, 1 growing season. It lasts 1 growing season, not even a year. 85 to 95 days. It might look like a tree, branches kind of like a tree. With Jesus listeners, they may not have been familiar with sequoias, but they knew what he was talking about, mustard trees, because they would grow it for what it did offer them. They knew what he was talking about. They were familiar with it. One of the reasons, and I'm not going to turn there because of time, but please look it up. But one of the reasons was because the Old Testament prophets, you could look at Ezekiel 31, 1 through 9. You can look at Ezekiel 17, 22 to 24, or you can look at Daniel 4, 10 to 18. And do you know what you're going to find? When they talked about, in the same imagery, about birds coming and resting in the branches, whether they were talking about Pharaoh, who had this great kingdom and he had dominated other lands, and the scriptures likened him in Ezekiel 31, likened him to a cedar tree, this massive cedar tree that grew tall and big branches, and there was a coming of the birds to rest in the branches. And in Ezekiel 17, the chosen people, when they're restored after the exile of Babylon, it talks about how he's going to take a sprig from the top of a cedar tree and plant it on the mountain in Israel, on the top of the mountain. Daniel chapter 4, same reference to cedars, but it's talking about again, getting into a little bit too much probably, but here they are in Babylonian exile, and they were taken away by Nebuchadnezzar, this Babylonian empire. And then while they're away and before they come back, Persia invades. And that was a multinational empire. These trees represented that. They represented that kind of kingdom. So Jesus teaching these people, they're familiar with kingdoms and they're looking forward to a kingdom that was like the kingdoms of the world. These massive things that are going to be around forever. And he says, my kingdom is a tree, but not really. One growing season. Don't you think that's really interesting? But here we are thousands of years later. Why wouldn't he say, it was like a sequoia? The church has been here. Church has been here for thousands of years. He's trying to make an incredibly important point that we're not missing. Do you know why? We're still trying to build sequoias. We're still amazed of the kingdoms of this world and trying to take what Jesus is doing. I just want you to think about that. They knew what the prophets said. The imageries shaped their ideas of what was going to happen. They knew what the kingdoms of the world were like. They were multi-ethnic. They were multinational. They were empires that were created by dominating and gathering multiple peoples, and then they would gather them into their core cities and redisperse them so they could take the power and control them. They didn't want their power to rise up again. And they became very oppressive. Some of them were a refuge, and yet they turned oppressive, like people of Israel were in Egypt. They went down there to escape the famine, and then they were oppressed. The kingdoms of this world, they were familiar. They were familiar with this, and they understood what it meant to be the birds who would seek refuge in this kingdom, because they did in their history with going to Egypt. But Jesus, he taught that his kingdom is like the mustard seed that would grow. He didn't say it was like the sequoia. Please don't miss this. Fresh every season. With Jesus, there's no second generation Christian. No second generation Christian. And one of the things the church struggles with is second generation church. Look at the book of Revelation. You've lost your first love. Revelations, chapters that are written to those 7 churches, they're written to second generation churches. Guys, we focus too much on the sequoia. Jesus says it's fresh every season. His kingdom, the kingdom he has where the birds come to rest, a place of safety that branches out, that provides the shade and the place of rest. Kind of looks like a tree, but it's not really a tree. Kind of looks like a kingdom, but it's a different kind of kingdom. Fresh every season, guys. His biggest point in this, I'm convinced, is it's fresh every season. He's doing a new life thing with every season, every generation. And what is Jesus doing with this whole leaven yeast thing? Just think about it with me. If you look at the scriptures, again, I'm not going to take a lot of time, go scripture to scripture. You can write them down and look at them, but you can look at New Testament, 1 Corinthians 5, 6 to 8, Matthew 16, 6 to 12. You can look at Luke 12, verse 1, Galatians 5, 9, Exodus 12, 15 to 20, Leviticus 2, 4 and 11. And do you know what you find there? That leaven is kind of villainized. And the way it's villainized is that evil works like leaven does. Like leaven works through the whole lump, the corruption and evil work through everything. And so here we are in this world where this is at work. Why would Jesus take on this battle and try to reestablish the virtue of something that has long been presented as something tagged evil? I think there's a few interesting things here. Leaven. First of all, it works through all the dough. Secondly, and I'm not going to go on and on about each of these things, but there's a rising, life-giving character to it. And where it says a woman hid it in, I think it's interesting because we focus on one thing and not the other. It wasn't a big, important teacher. It wasn't a prophet of the stature of Elijah. He says a woman, just an average, everyday woman. We're not talking about somebody who ran the town bakery. We're talking about a woman who just an ordinary person. And there's this mixing of this little bit of yeast and this 3 measures of dough, which creates enough to feed 100 people. And what this woman does in putting this yeast in this large measure of flour, it works through all the dough. His whole point was, please listen, it's really not that complicated. You might think in terms of leaven as an agent of evil. It was just how it works. And he took that very thing, the very thing that discourages us. We see the work of the darkness, we work the work of the devil, and we want to withdraw. We want to step back. We want to guard and protect ourselves because evil is so destructive and so powerful. And you know what he's saying is? He says, kingdom of heaven? Oh, it's this leaven that works just like evil, and it will work through all the dough, and there will be a rising, and the bread's going to be good. What he's saying is, just like there's this work that looks hopelessly evil, infected world, so evil has worked. Jesus' kingdom will work like the leaven as well, and he will rise. He will work. In fact, look at Ephesians 2, 1-10. I do want to turn to this passage. It's so important with what we're talking about. In Ephesians 2, 1-10, Paul makes the same point when he says, and you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that's now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived. And he's talking about these things. I'm not going to read every verse, but then he says in verse 4, but God, being rich in mercy because of the great love which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you've been saved. You know what he's saying? He's saying, here we are dead, no different than this lump of dough. But this yeast of God's work is put in here. And it works through, it makes us alive together with. And Paul's writing here says, God sent Christ to make us alive together with. That we see that rising. Personal thing, yeah, but it's also a global thing. Jesus said, go out into all the world. Matthew 18:18-20. I just have a few things to say as we wrap this up. I want to understand, and I want to rise into life that Jesus Christ brings, right? His transforming work, his giftings, his love, agape love with grace. I want his spirit taking me out of my place of being dead, and I want to see him restoring me and his work rising and bringing me to life. And while I hope, and I hope I'm not misunderstood here, and while I hope Agora is an enduring ministry, I celebrate the life cycle we enjoy. We have been and are a place where we see birds coming and nesting. We have sprawling branches that some people don't understand, why we do this, why we do that. We have been becoming. Why do I say becoming? Because it says it is the smallest of seeds, but when it has grown, it's larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree. There's this thing of becoming. We've been becoming since we began in 1995, 1994, depending on where you consider we started. Everywhere I look, I see evidence of the life-giving work of Jesus Christ in a light in darkness. In lives where Jesus' resurrection power works together with, where there's a rising. Whether others can see it or not, I don't know. What matters is what God plants and his overpowering of good, which works like the yeast, permeating and making alive together with. That's what counts. Is he working that there's fruit, that there's harvest. Churches who are of the kingdom of the heavens. Churches who are of the kingdom of the heavens, yes, they will celebrate as we do. We should not be distracted with dreams of being a sequoia. We need to ask the question, how might we plant the seed for the next generation while it's God who gives the life? It was just a common, ordinary woman who introduced the yeast to the dough. How do we plant the seed? How might we introduce the yeast? How do we flourish today for a great mustard tree, sort of, tomorrow? So when you go back to look at, some of these things, sequoia, 10 to 20 years before there's seeds, acorns. You know what the mustard tree? 12 weeks during one life cycle. So when I think about the 20th century and all of these things that I just listed, all these 25 things I listed, I'm not going to go through them again. You don't need to worry. But do you know how many people who are believers who were out there developing the airplane industry or standing at the counter when you buy your ticket? How many people that were out there developing the auto industry? You could go down through every one of these. And while we want to look at what evil's done with them, we're supposed to be the people out in the world where we're engaged in these things, but where God is working during our life cycle with him. The church, it's one generation. And so when you look at it, let's not celebrate the sequoia. God's intention, Jesus' intention was never to see it take 3,000 years or 20 years for the first acorn to find some purpose or fulfillment or meaning. We're supposed to be people out there serving one life cycle. And while that might seem discouraging, I talked about how invasive the species is, but not in Palestine. You know, you can go over there and you can find mustard seeds according to AI. You can find mustard seeds. If there was a mustard seed tree growing there, it's probably been growing there a long time. They're all through the soil, and the seeds themselves, they stay good 50 plus years. Incredible thing. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves, with the generation that we are celebrating what God has done among us in this life cycle, what are we doing? Like the woman, what are we mixing in? What are we introducing of the Lord for the next generation? What mustard seed is being planted for the next generation, for the next life cycle? We need to step back, all of us, even those that are in churches that look like the sequoia. And we need to step back and say, no, but what is it? This life cycle that's going to give birth to a fresh new thing with the next life cycle. Father, I want to thank you for your word. And I want to thank you for Jesus. He was so far ahead of us in what he taught and how. And yet he didn't do it to, he taught in the parables that people would see and understand. And your word tells us where we seek you and look to you for understanding. You open things up. You help us understand. So God, I just pray that you would just help us to consider and understand what you're trying to show and teach us. We want to see your life, your work thrive. We want to see you cause the dough to rise, the bread to rise. Thank you for your love and your grace. And I just want to thank you for life every season. In your name I pray, amen.
Sorry.